Consider this: an English teacher at Mount Eden High School in California teaches the book called The Hidden Tyranny, written by Benjamin H. Friedman, a Holocaust denier who claims, quote, Jews control a brainwashing monopoly over US media and that Jews manipulated world events to achieve domination. The Washington Post reports that, quote, this case in California is particularly troubling, not just because of the anti-Semitic text, but because of the school administration's slow response and failure to quickly denounce the text. And the incident, as we speak, is still being resolved 3 months later. Now, this is not the Holocaust, but it is not trivial. Okay, Philip Gurevich, he was a writer for the New Yorker magazine, in his book on the Rwandan genocide, wrote that what distinguished genocide from ordinary political violence is the intent. He writes, the crime is wanting to make a people extinct. The idea is the crime. Okay, the idea is the crime. And there are a lot of people in the world who, under the right circumstances, would subscribe to that idea even today. So tonight's event is an important reminder where intolerance and xenophobia can lead, if followed through, to its perversely logical end. I'd like to thank the Jewish Federation of Dutchess County and Dutchess Community College for collaborating once again on tonight's ceremony. Thanks to the Yom HaShoah Committee, which consisted of Rabbi Rennie Altman, Kenta Devora Gardner, Jeff Gross, Muriel Horowitz, Karen Hochhauser, Pam and Michael Smith, and Paula Reckes. A very special thanks goes to the committee member, Paula Reckes, who generously once again sponsored the reception in the Ritz Lounge following the event. I have heard from the college president, Dr. Peter Jordan, that he would be here tonight, and I don't see him, and that is probably because he's busy with the accreditation team. We have the we are going to hopefully re-accredit it as a college. Yeah. Yeah, they arrived yesterday, so he may just be held up with them. So, Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day, known colloquially in Israel and abroad as Yom HaShoah, starts tonight and lasts until sundown tomorrow. Yom HaShoah was inaugurated in 1953 as an official holiday in Israel, but has been since observed the world over. There's not a precise blueprint for the ceremony, though the lighting of memorial candles and the recital of the Kaddish, the prayer for the departed, are the most common features in the ceremony. Yom HaShoah is always scheduled during the week following the end of the Passover holiday in remembrance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which took place during Passover in 1943, and which we have the 85th anniversary this year. So on this day, we remember the victims, those who perished in the cataclysm of violence unleashed by the Nazis against Europe's Jews. We honor the survivors who bore witness and whose stories embody important lessons for future generations. And we remember heroism and resistance. But the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising also coincided with the so-called Bermuda Conference, when in 1943, high-ranking American and British officials met in Bermuda to discuss the quote-unquote refugee situation at a time when there were no more Jewish refugees, and the majority of Polish, Baltic, and Ukrainian Jews had already been murdered. So we should also remember indifference when nations and institutions turned their backs. So we are then ready to start the proceedings, and I would like to ask for the lighting of the candles, and Rabbi Altman will hold the microphone to the respective candle lighters. The first candle will be lit by Jeff Gross.
Thank you. I'm lighting this in memory of my mother and her sisters who survived Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. and to the memory of all the family they lost, including their parents and many aunts and uncles and cousins.
The second candle will be lit by Ralph Price.
I light this in memory of my grandmother, who on her way to Theresienstadt died, and also my uncle and aunt and 2 cousins who died on the way to Auschwitz.
The third candle will be lit by Gila and Ari Rekes. Oh, and bonus Jake. I didn't mean to overlook you.
We are lighting in honor and memory of our 4 grandparents who all survived, 2 great-grandparents who survived that I had a chance to meet, and many of their family who did not survive, our family.
And the fourth candle will be lit by Claire Shushny.
Thank you. This is in memory of several uncles and aunts, especially aunts in Budapest who died. I did not know them, but they were my father's family. And some schoolmates of mine who died also.
And the fifth candle will be lit by Marlene Strauss.
I think I'd like to say that I'm not lighting this candle in memory and in honor of all those who perished. And the piece of me that says, not only do we think about those who perish, but think about the commitment that we have to remember.
And the sixth candle will be lit by Jakub Weintraub.
In memory of my grandmothers, Rivka and Bella, my grandfathers, Yaakov and Shimshon, many aunts and uncles that I didn't know. In memory of my parents who survived as refugees, and in honor of my Doda Esther at 98, living in Israel now with over 30 children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and she burns as bright as these candles.
A candle in the memory of the righteous Gentiles will be lighted by Jeff Urban, education specialist from the FDR Presidential Library.
These 6 memorial candles represent the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah, the Holocaust. They are lit by their spouses, their children, and their children's children in their memory. As time has marched on, their number has dwindled to a precious few, but we remember them. We are grateful for the time we had with them, and we mourn their loss. We will keep their memories alive and tell their stories. We will never forget.
Rabbi. I light this candle in remembrance of the righteous Gentiles who placed their own lives in danger for the sake of our persecuted and tortured Jewish brothers and sisters during the Holocaust. They were shining stars in an overwhelming darkness of evil. They spoke out in a time of silence. They offered sanctuary and a lease on life in the eye of the murderous storm. People of faith and conscience, in the very valley of the shadow of death, these men and women saved few and many. Where there were no human beings, they were human, and we honor their memory.
As I mentioned earlier, this year is the 85th year after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, so I will read an excerpt from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising by Yad Vashem. On the 19th April 1943, Passover Eve, the Germans entered the ghetto. The remaining Jews knew that the Germans would murder them and decided to resist. The invading German forces were surprised by the ferocity of the resistance of the armed groups and by the perseverance of the ghetto inhabitants, who had fortified themselves in bunkers and hiding places. The fighting outposts of the Jewish Fighting Organization were spread out far and wide across the ghetto. The Jewish Military Union fought side by side with the Jewish Fighting Organization. After 3 days of fighting, the Germans understood they would be unable to make the Jews report for deportation as planned. In order to overcome the Jewish fighters and force them out of their hiding places, the Germans began systematically setting fire to the buildings in the Warsaw Ghetto and blowing them up. The Jewish combatants took refuge in bunkers from which they would launch attacks and raids on German units. Most of the Jewish fighters did not view their actions as an effective measure by which to save themselves, but rather as a battle for the honor of the Jewish people and a protest against the world's silence. Those who succeeded in escaping the burning ghetto continued their struggle on the Aryan side of the city or in the ranks of the partisans. For almost a month, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto fought for their lives. Many of them perished in the fires and smoke of the uprising. Others were murdered in the ghetto streets. The remainder were sent to Treblinka, Majdanek, and other camps in the Lublin area. Few managed to escape. The ghetto was transformed into a wasteland. On the 16th of May, 1943, the Germans destroyed the Great Synagogue on Dlomiatskie Street in Warsaw, in an act which proclaimed the final suppression of the ghetto uprising. General Jürgen Stroop added the following caption to the photo album documenting the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He said, "There is no longer a Jewish quarter in Warsaw." So I'm calling on Kanta Devora for the musical selection.
Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg. Gott Himmeln bläne, verstädlen bläue Ding. Willkommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show. Sveta pojkton und zetrot mir seinen Do. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show. Sveta pojkton und zetrot mir seinen Do. Say not, behold, my journey's end thus comes to me, while heavy clouds conceal the light and darkness drear. The time we yearn for we shall surely know and see, and then our tramping feet shall tell that we are here. The time we yearn for we shall surely know and see, and then our tramping feet shall tell that we are here.
Okay. Stanza 1 from Yizkor 1943 will be read by Rachel Auerbach. Oh, no, I'm sorry, written by Rachel Auerbach, read by Lila Ritz, Congregation Shomrei Israel, and Kulano Youth Group.
I saw a flood once in the mountains. Wooden huts torn from their foundations were carried above the raging waters. One could still see lighted lamps in them, and men, women, and children in their cradles were tied to the ceiling beams. Other huts were empty inside, but one could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof. At a distance, one could see mouths gaping, but one could not hear the cries, because the roar of the waters drowned out everything.
Stanza 2 from Yizkor 1943 will be read by Rabbi Rennie Altman, Vassar Temple.
And that's how the Jewish masses flowed to their destruction at the time of the deportations, sinking as helplessly into the deluge of destruction. And if, for even one of the days of my life, I should forget how I saw you then, my people, desperate and confused, delivered over to extinction, may all knowledge of me be forgotten, and my name be cursed, like that of those traitors who are unworthy to share your pain.
Stanza 3 will be read by Rabbi Michael Fessler, Temple Beth El.
Who can render the stages of the dying of a people? Only the shudder of pity for oneself and for others. And again illusion, waiting for the chance miracle. The insane smile of hope in the eyes of the incurable patient. Ghastly reflections of color on the yellowed face of one who is condemned to death.
Stanza 4 will be read by Rabbi Neil Levenger, Director of Spiritual Care, Chaplaincy at Vassar Brothers Medical Center.
Condemned to death, who wished to understand such a thing? And who could have expected such a degree against such low branches, such simple Jews? The lowly plants of the world, the sorts of people who would have lived out their lives without ever picking a quarrel with the righteous, or even the unrighteous, of this world. How could such a people have been prepared to die in a gas chamber? The sorts of people who were terrified of a dentist chair, who turned pale at the pulling of a tooth.
Stanza 5 will be read by Galit Geva, PGL Library, PJ Our Way alumna.
Even the sweetest ones, the 2- and 3-year-olds who seemed like newly hatched chicks, tottering about on their weak legs. And even the slightly larger ones who could already talk, who endlessly asked about the meanings of words. 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, and those who were older still, their eyes wide open with curiosity about the whole world. Girls who still nursed their dolls off in corners, who wore ribbons in their hair. Girls, like sparrows, leaping about in courtyards and on garden paths, to whose cheeks the very first wind of summer seemed to have given its first glowing caress. Girls of 11, 12, 13, with the faces of angels.
Rabbi Miriam Hyman, Temple Beth El, will sing the musical selection Tum Balalaika.
Steht ab und Tracht und Tracht den ganzen Nacht, Leben zu nehmen und nicht verschämen, Leben zu nehmen und nicht verschämen. Tumbalala, tumbalala, tumbalalaika, tumbalala, tumbalala, tumbalalaika, tumbalalaika, spiel balalaika.
Stanzas 6 and 7 from Yizkor 1943 will be read by Annabelle Hirschfield from the Kulano Youth Group.
And pious Jews in black gabardines, looking like priests in their medieval garb, Jews who were rabbis, teachers, who wanted to transform our earthly life into a long study of Torah and prayer to God. They were the first to feel the scorn of the butcher. Their constant talk of martyrdom turned out not to be mere empty words. And still other Jews, broad-shouldered, deep-voiced, with powerful hands and hearts, artisans, workers, wagon drivers, porters, Jews who, with a blow of their fists, could floor any hooligan who dared enter their neighborhoods. You were swept away in the flood, together with those who were weak.
Stanza 8 will be read by Penelope Hirschfield from the Kulano Youth Group.
Grandfathers and grandmothers with an abundance of grandchildren, with hands like withered leaves, who already trembled at the latter of their days. They were not descendants to simply disline wearing into their graves like rest-seeking souls, like in the sun sinking wearily into the ocean's waves. No, that it was decreed that before they died they would go to see their destruction, all that they have begotten, all that they have built.
It is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Elizabeth Hyman, who will speak on the women of the Warsaw Ghetto. Elizabeth Hyman is the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of Polish Jews who fled that country in 1939 and ultimately made their way as refugees to the United States. Raised in New Paltz, New York, Elizabeth earned her BA with a dual major in history and journalism from Purchase College, SUNY, in 2010. In fall 2011, Elizabeth began her graduate work in the University of Maryland College Park's Joint History and Library Science Master's degree program. In May 2014, she defended her thesis called An Uncertain Life in Another World, German and Austrian Jewish Refugee Life in Shanghai, 1938 to 1950, and she graduated with 2 master's degrees. She spent 7 years working as an archivist and digital content manager with the American Jewish Historical Society at the Center for Jewish History in New York City. In June 2022, Elizabeth presented the paper called Tima Schneiderman and Tosia Altman, Voices from Beyond the Grave, at the Heroines of the Holocaust, New Frameworks of Resistance International Symposium at Wagner College. Later that summer, Elizabeth was invited to give a talk titled Women and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising at the National World War II Museum's 15th International Conference on World War II. She presented this talk in November 18, 2022. Her first book, tentatively titled The Girl Bandits of the Warsaw Ghetto, A Female Military History of the Warsaw Ghetto and Its Uprising, will be published by HarperCollins in the fall of 2025. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Ms. Hyman.
Thank you, Dr. Steger, for your introduction. The readings you just heard from our wonderful readers over there are from the poem Yizkor 1943 by Rachel Auerbach. I now continue through a final stanza of this piece. I have so many names to recall. How can I leave any of them out, since nearly all of them went off to Belzec and Treblinka, or were killed on the spot? Absurd, I will utter no more names. They are all mine, all related, all who were killed, who are no more. Those whom I knew and loved press on my memory, which I now compare to a cemetery, the only cemetery in which there are still indications that they once lived in this world. I may neither groan nor weep. I may not draw attention to myself in the street. And I need to groan. I need to weep, not 4 times a year. I feel the need to say Yizkor 4 times a day. Auerbach composed this piece in November 1943, after the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, after its uprising, and after its destruction at the hands of the Nazis. Born in 1903, Rachel Auerbach studied psychology at the University of Lvov. A talented and prolific writer, Rachel began her literary career in 1925, moving to Warsaw, home of the largest Jewish community in Europe in 1933. She thrived there among the city's numerous theaters, publishing houses, cafes, art galleries, libraries, and museums, and socialized with the city's Jewish intellectual elite. When Poland fell to the Nazis in September 1939, Jewish historian Emanuel Ringelblum recruited Rachel into the Alleinhilfe, the Jewish self-help organization of the Warsaw Ghetto. Ringelblum put Rachel in charge of a soup kitchen, a position which allowed her to observe a wide swath of the ghetto's inhabitants. In 1941, Ringelblum recruited Rachel into the Oyneg Shabbos, or Pleasures of the Sabbath, his underground group dedicated to documenting life in the Warsaw Ghetto as it happened, without analysis or commentary. He asked Rachel to write for the archive regular reports on her experiences in the soup kitchen. In both these reports and her post-war writings, Auerbach described the ordinary people she worked with each day at that soup kitchen on Let's Know Street. There was the efficient bookkeeper, Helena Gelblum, whose competence soothed the nerves of the rest of the staff. There was the 16-year-old Haney, who was always smiling and flirting with the boys who worked in the kitchen. There was Yuchke, the cook, talented, yet often at odds with Auerbach's fastidious approach to hygiene. She would sing to herself in Yiddish as she bustled about the kitchen, talk to the pots and pans, and test the soup with her fingers. There was Dama, a once wealthy woman who, as Auerbach wrote, had been wearing for many weeks a black Georgette cocktail dress, dragged down at the bottom in uneven tails, the seams plastered with knits, on her head a cloth jockey cap, yellow with brown stripes, perhaps from some skiing costume, and over her shoulder, weighing her down, inseparable collections of large bags and small handbags stuffed with what few possessions she has left. Ringelblum so valued Rachel's reports that he soon gave her additional assignments. One of these was to conduct interviews with those who had escaped from the Treblinka death camp and returned to the ghetto. These escapees were brought to the attention of the Oyneg Shabbos through the work of two young female underground couriers, Chavka Folman and Frumka Plotnika, who once smuggled grenades hidden in a basket of potatoes into the Warsaw Ghetto. Those interviews became critical to alerting the outside world of the extermination of Polish Jewry. After the war, Rachel, with fellow Oyneg Shabbos survivors Hirsch and Bluma Wasser, was critical to the recovery of the archive, which the Oyneg Shabbos buried beneath the ghetto in summer 1942, when the Nazis liquefied the Warsaw Ghetto, rounding up 90% of its inhabitants, over 300,000 individuals, and sending them by cattle car to their deaths at Treblinka. In April 1946, at a meeting held to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto uprising on its 3rd anniversary, Auerbach, the only female speaker present, stood up and said, "We cannot rest until we dig up the archive. Even if there are 5 stories of ruins, we have to find the archive. I will not rest, and I will not let you rest. We must rescue the Ringelblum archive." Eventually, through her persistence and assistance from the Jewish Labor Committee in New York, the search began that summer, 1946. Thanks to Rachel Auerbach, the majority of the archive was recovered from beneath the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto and would become one of the most vital sources on daily life therein. The Alleinhilfe was not the only organization of its kind operating in the Warsaw Ghetto. Most homes in Warsaw were built in clusters of 4, with a shared courtyard between them. During the initial occupation of the city and the first months of the ghetto's existence, house committees began to emerge in these courtyards. The house committees provided to the cluster's residents childcare, communal kitchens, and illegal educational and cultural activities. By April 1940, There were 778 house committees operating in the Warsaw Ghetto. By early 1942, there were 1,108, with 7,500 members between them. One such member was a young woman named Hannah Freisdorf, who would go on to fight in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and escape the burning ghetto through the sewers under the leadership of Zivia Lubetkin, the highest-ranking woman in the Jewish fighting organization. In an abridged section of a talk she delivered after the war, Memories of the Warsaw Ghetto, Hannah briefly discussed the illegal educational activities conducted by the House committees, activities in which she took part. This source was provided to me by Hannah's niece, Eddie Goldwasser. According to Goldwasser, this is the only public statement Hannah ever made about her experiences in the Holocaust. She wrote, "What has not been spoken of is the important role of the Hof, the courtyard, played in the life of the ghetto. Because the police curfew began at 6 p.m., effectively prohibiting anyone from leaving the apartment after that hour, life within the confines of the 4 Hof walls took on unprecedented significance. Let Gench 33 serve as an example. Before the war, some 80 families lived in this building. Though acquainted with one another, they did not socialize much, but during the ghetto years, over 1,000 people, those who had been driven out of nearby neighborhoods and those who had originally lived in Warsaw outside the ghetto walls, were crammed into the building. When curfew fell at 6 p.m. and the gates closed, people, including children, began gathering in the Hof to walk around until late into the night. In the courtyard, they exchanged news about daily life, discussed the miracle of surviving yet another day, and gave voice to rumors of true and false, recounting them over and over. Gradually, the inhabitants of the Hof became more and more intimately connected, and the Hof itself actually became a shtetl. Quite naturally, there arose a wish for an organized cooperative way of life, and it fell to a group of the older activists to organize and create a Hof committee. The organizers felt that it was their responsibility to look after the spiritual and bodily well-being of those who lived within the Hof's quarters. The first job was to raise money for feeding the hungry, since there were people close to starvation. It was difficult, yet funds were found and a soup kitchen was started. Every day, several women volunteered to work there, cooking and serving supper. One good meal a day saved dozens of families from starvation. Some 40 teenagers would meet every evening in a room and spend several hours together, talking, discussing, reading books. For a few hours each night, they were able to forget their cares and their hunger. For a few hours, they were young again. And these same youngsters took it upon themselves to be concerned with those even younger, helping them to live a little, making them laugh, sing, and play. So a children's corner was created, a kind of ghetto school. During the day, it accommodated the smaller children, and at night, the 18-year-olds. And it was terribly hard work to deal with shivering and starving children in a cold, unheated room for 6 or 7 hours a day. How much ingenuity and effort were summoned by untrained teachers to keep the children interested, to keep them from running out into the streets to grab or steal something to eat. And what strength it took for the teachers, cold and hungry themselves, to stand for hours at a time, teaching kids between 6 and 13 in one room, without educational materials, without toys. But they accomplished their aims. Both teacher and student knew what awaited them should they be caught attending this clandestine school. But fear held no one back. No child gave up his or her place. Back then, we put in so much of our heart and hard work, and this was not a time when hundreds of people were dying of starvation and illness, when not a single household was without a member stricken by typhus. A time when the Germans snatched people off the street for work details and dragged young men from their beds at night. At this moment, when energies were being depleted, it became important to find comfort, to give each other hope." End quote. These house committees quickly became the center of public life in the Warsaw Ghetto. And more often than not, these committees were managed and staffed by female volunteers. And for most of these women, this was the first time in their lives that they were able to step into leadership roles. Many of them thrived, finding within themselves strength which they had never before had reason to access. However, this change in women's traditional behavior went beyond the confines of the courtyard. One such process is illustrated in the recollections of Fegele Peltel, better known to the world as Vlad Kamid, a courier and arms smuggler for the Jewish resistance and later a Holocaust educator. During the siege of Warsaw in September 1939, the Jews and the Poles experienced a brief moment of unity as they rushed to their city's defense. Yet, the food, water, gas, and electric shortages which accompanied the German siege put a quick end to this showing of camaraderie. As the Germans marched into the city, they fanned the flames of Polish anti-Semitism. For example, as they set up soup and bread lines for Polish civilians, they encouraged the Poles to drive Jews out of the lines with such statements as, "The Jews deprive the Poles of their spoonful of soup." On September 28, 1939, a cheerful Jewish man named Shlomo Peltel was standing in one of these lines. He'd encountered German soldiers during their occupation of the city in World War I, and had found them to be friendly and courteous. But as he stood on that breadline, the Poles around him began to mutter that he was a Jew. As their mutterings grew louder, a German soldier grabbed Shlomo, pulled him roughly out of the line, and beat him. According to Fegele, his oldest daughter, this experience was traumatic for Shlomo, and afterwards he retreated into the family home a broken man, no longer able to support, provide for, or protect the family as he had in the days before the occupation. Before the war, Shlomo had owned a modest haberdashery. When the store was struck by a German bomb in the early days of the invasion, the Peltels were able to salvage some of the merchandise which could be sold for cash on the black market. Those sorts of transactions, however, were only conducted in parts of the city declared off-limits to Jews. The shattered Shlomo certainly couldn't undertake such a mission, but Fegele, a Bundist activist with features more Aryan than Jewish, certainly could. And so Fegele loaded up their wares and sold them on the black market, stood in the bread lines, and just like that took on the role of family provider. Shlomo was not alone. Finding themselves unable to act as breadwinners and protectors, Jewish men struggled and often failed to adapt, leaving their wives and daughters to support the family. Further, men were the typical targets of Nazi forced labor roundups. German gangs would seize Jewish men at random and force them to engage in all manner of labor, from road construction to forest clearance, typically designed to exhaust even the most physically fit of men. These forced laborers were subject to random and brutal violence, and many died from a combination of exhaustion, hunger, heart failure, and exposure. As husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers returned from work assignments sick, beaten, and traumatized and retreated into the home, their wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters emerged from its confines. As Emanuel Ringelblum wrote in his diary, "Women's perseverance, the main providers. Men don't go out. When a man is seized for forced labor, the wife does not let go. She runs after the kidnappers. She screams and cries, 'Please, mister.' She is not afraid of the soldiers. She stands on the long line. Some are seized to work. The beautiful hats have disappeared. In wartime, women put on scarves. When there is need to go to the Gestapo, the wife or daughter goes. In the worst scenario, they stand and wait in the hallway. The women are everywhere since the men have been taken to do all sorts of work. When a husband escapes, his wife has to be the sole provider. Women who never thought of working out of their homes are now performing the most difficult physical work." While women expressed satisfaction and indeed newfound empowerment with their new roles and responsibilities, the enforced starvation, terror, and poverty of daily life in the Warsaw Ghetto took their toll. Women abandoned their children on the front steps of orphanages and self-help institutions in the hope that their children might have a chance at survival. Some women worked as smugglers and prostitutes to provide for their families, often with the tacit approval of their husbands and parents. Once wealthy women took work as house cleaners, while female nurses and doctors worked relentlessly at the impossible task of containing the typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis outbreaks which plagued the ghetto. Some of these doctors and nurses described their own attempts to shield their patients from pain and suffering, even as the Nazis were forcing Jews onto the cattle cars which would bear them to their deaths. In her memoir, I Remember Nothing More, Dr. Adina Blady-Sweiger recalled, "Sister Mira came for me. I can't remember her last name, but I still see her face in front of me as if she were here now. And she asked me to go downstairs with her for a moment. When we left the ward, she said, and I can still hear this, 'Doctor, please give my mother an injection. I can't do it. I beg you, please. I don't want them to shoot her in her bed, and she can't walk.' So I asked what was in the syringe, and she told me it was morphine. We went to the first floor where the families of staff were, and so that gray-haired lady smiled at me and stretched out her arm. The sister put on the clamp, and I injected the morphine into her vein. And then I saw a few more people who didn't have the strength to move. I asked Mira what we should do, and she said, 'Help them, surely.' So we helped them too. And by the window, there was this woman swollen from starvation and suffering from circulatory insufficiency, and she kept looking at us, pleading with her eyes. She was the last one we gave an injection to. When I left the room, I held out my hand and got 2 containers of morphine. We didn't say a word to each other, just squeezed each other's hands, I think. I took the morphine upstairs. Dr. Margolis was there, and I told her what I wanted to do. So we took a spoon and went to the infant's room. And just as during those 2 years of real work in the hospital, I had bent down over the little beds, and so now I poured this last medicine into those tiny mouths. Only Dr. Margolis was with me, and downstairs there was screaming because the Germans were already there, taking the sick from the wards to the cattle trucks. After that, we went in to the older children and told them that this medicine was going to make their pain disappear. They believed us and drank the required amount from the glass. And then I told them to undress, get into bed, and sleep. So they lay down, and after a few minutes, I don't know how many, but the next time I went into that room, they were asleep. And then I don't know what happened. These ordinary women rose to meet circumstances unimaginable to them even 2 years earlier. Their resistance was not of the military variety that comes to mind when we discuss the concept of resistance, but each act, each dose administered, each child taught, each person allowed to live one more day was an act of resistance. There were women in the Warsaw Ghetto who did engage in resistance as we typically think of it, as fighters, armed smugglers, spies, and commanders. And despite what 80 years of novels, comic books, films, and theaters would have us think, women were present and vital at every stage of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. I have already mentioned several of these women: couriers and armed smugglers, Chavka Folman, Frumka Plotnika, Hanna Freistorff, Zivia Lubetkin, and Vladka Mead. The female couriers acquired guns, explosives, and ammunitions, smuggled them past German guards, and into the ghetto. They slept with chemical explosives and instructions for the manufacture of homemade bombs under their pillows, and smuggled dynamite into the ghetto through labyrinthine passageways of the factories which abutted the ghetto. In her memoir, They Are Still With Me, Chavka Folman wrote of one such mission. For a short while, I lived in the same room with Tima Schneiderman. Under the bed was a suitcase containing pistols and grenades. Tima and I brought the grenades to the ghetto. Each of the girls hid a grenade in her most intimate place, her undergarments. From a suburb of the city, we took a streetcar in the direction of the ghetto. I recall our odd behavior during the ride. Tima stood by my side and asked what would happen if a gentleman invited us to sit beside him. We broke into laughter, hiding our fear in this way. Jewish Fighting Organization commander Yitzhak Entek Zuckerman wrote that he would never forget the celebration which took place in honor of courier Frumka Plotnica when she smuggled the Jewish Fighting Organization's first weapons acquisition, those basketed grenades, into the Warsaw Ghetto. Stories such as these proliferate through the diaries, memoirs, autobiographies, and testimonies of surviving members of the Jewish Fighting Organization. Male and female resistance leaders alike made it very clear in their post-war writings and testimonies that no uprising could have happened without the women, many of whom were discovered, tortured, and murdered over the course of their missions. Indeed, a courier named Hasia began her underground work in a group of 23 women. Only 5 survived. When the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began on April 19, 1943, women served as sharpshooters, reconnaissance officers, fighters, and commanders. And today, the 27th of Nisan, is the day of Yom HaShoah, as set by the Israeli parliament in 1953 to align with the events of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Today, as we approach the 80th anniversary of that uprising, we remember these women of the Warsaw Ghetto, their courage, their loss, and their resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and I greatly look forward to the book. I should also apologize that I have referred to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising's 85th anniversary, and that's not because I'm bad in math. I must have thought about, because in November, the 85th anniversary of the Kristallnacht pogrom is coming up, so my mind, because I have a commitment then, and I must have, so I'm not that bad at math. I'd like to call on Rabbi Neil Levinger for Yizkor.
Yizkor Elohim neshamot kol acheinu b'nei Israel shemasru et nafsham al kiddush Hashem. Hineni noder tzedakad ba'ad hezkarat neshmotehem. Ana yishama aheinu hed gvuratam suratam v'yira b'masenu tohar libam tehenu nafshotehem surot b'tzurcha hayim utehem menuchatam kavod smachot et panecha nimot b'mincha netzach. Amen. May the Holy One remember the souls of our martyrs who gave their lives for the sanctification of God's name, for the preservation of our people, and the redemption and protection of the Holy Land. May their heroism and sacrificial devotion be reflected in our thoughts and deeds. May their souls be bound up in the bond of life, and their memories abide among us as an enduring source of blessing. Let us say, Amen.
Rabbi Michael Fessler for El Malay Rahamim.
I'd like to invite those who are able to rise. El Malay Rahamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hamtze Menucha Nechona, Tachat Chen Peshchina, במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר כי הם מזהירים את נשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנטבחו ושנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם. אנא בעל הרחמים הסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרו בצרור חיים את נשמותיהם. Adonai nachalatam v'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkavoteihem v'nomar. Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure, to the souls of all our brethren who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered, suffocated, and burned to ashes. May their memory endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. May their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life eternal. May they rest in peace. And let us say, Amen.
The Kaddish of Remembrance will be led by Rabbi Rennie Altman, Vassar Temple.
Please join with me in this special Kaddish written by Elie Wiesel. Yitgadal Auschwitz, Yitgadash Lodz, Shemei Rabbah Ponar, Ba'alma Divrach Yurutei Babiyar, V'yamlich Malchutei Maidanik, V'chayechon Uv'yomechon Birkenau, V'chayei Dechol Beit Yisrael Kovno, Ba'agala Uvizman Kariv Yanauska, V'imru Amen. Yehei Shemei Rabbah Mevarach Leolam Olamei Olamaya. Yitbarach V'yishtabach Theresienstadt. Yitba'ar V'yitromam Buchenwald. V'yitnaseh V'yithadar Treblinka. V'yitale V'yitala Vilna. Shemed Kudsha Barichu Bergen-Belsen. La'ela Mauthausen. Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Dachau. Tushbachata v'nechemata Minsk, da'amiran ba'alma Varsa, v'imru Amen. Yehei Shlomo Rabba min Shemaya v'chayim, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen.
The legacy will be read by Paula Reckes and her family.
We take this oath. We take it in the shadow of flames whose tongues sear the soul of our people. We vow in the names of our dead grandparents, parents, and children. We vow with our sadness hidden, our faith renewed. We take this oath. Vision becomes word to be handed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, from generation to generation. Remember what the Nazi killers and their accomplices did to our people. Remember what an indifferent world did to us and to itself. Remember the victims with pride and with sorrow. We shall also remember the miracle of the Jewish rebirth in the land of our ancestors, in the independent state of Israel. Here, pioneers and fighters return to our people the dignity and the majesty of nationhood. To the end of our days, we shall remember all those who raised their dream, our dream of redemption to the loftiest heights. Also remember the deeds of the righteous Gentiles. We take this oath, let our legacy endure as a stone of the temple wall in Jerusalem, where our prayers and memories burn. They burn and will not be consumed.
Please join us, if you can. We accept the obligation of the legacy. We are the generation born after the darkness. Through our parents' and grandparents' memories, words and silence, we are linked to that annihilated Jewish existence whose echoes permeate our consciousness. We dedicate this pledge to you, our families and friends who suffered and survived, to our grandparents, to all those who perished in flames, to our vanished young brothers and sisters, more than 1 million Jewish children so brutally murdered, to all 6 million whose unyielding spiritual and physical resistance, even in the camps and ghettos, exemplifies our people's commitment to life. We pledge to remember. We shall teach our children to preserve forever that uprooted Jewish spirit which could not be destroyed. We shall tell the world of the depths to which humanity can sink, and the heights which were attained, even in hell itself. We shall fight anti-Semitism and all forms of racial hatred by our dedication to freedom throughout the world. We affirm our commitment to the State of Israel and to the furtherance of Jewish life in our homeland. We pledge ourselves to the oneness of the Jewish people. We are your children. We are here.
Kolod balevav penima, nefesh Yehudi homia, ulfate mizrach kadima, ayin letzion Sophia. Od lo avda tikvatenu, ha-tikva bat shnot alpayim, liot am chofshi be'artzenu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim, liot am chofshi be'artzenu, Eretz Zion Yerushalayim.
Thank you all for coming, and again, I would like to thank the committee, the Yom HaShoah committee, particularly Kenta Devora, who was putting the, sort of the contents of this program together, and Paula Reckes, who organized the candlelighters. There is a reception, I hope. Oh, there is. Okay, good. Yeah, there was no setup at the beginning. So there's going to be a reception. Thanks again, Paula, for donating this, and it's going to be across the hallway in the Ritz Lounge. I'll see you over there.
Excuse me.
Oh.
Is there 9 people who could join me for a really quick Mari opinion, either right after or right before the reception? I have to say, gosh, no. Great. So why don't we just come down here, and those